3D combat by its nature is extremely complex, because if you compare it to 2D combat, even a belt-scrolling beat-em-up, in 2D you have left, right in this sort of pseudo Z-axis. I call it pseudo because in 2D you can have enemies still overlapping with one another on the Z-axis and it doesn't look insane. Whereas in 3D combat, that's not the case. The enemies need to take up space in the X, Y, and Z-axis, and they can't overlap. They need to be physical objects in real, true 3D space. And that creates a lot of problems in terms of a combat system. The big one being, how do you solve this question of allowing the player to reliably deal with multiple enemies at once with potential overlapping attacks? I think how a 3D game answers this question is what defines its design. That is what makes one 3D combat game significantly different from another. So some examples: Devil May Cry, you have the iframe jump and a real emphasis on verticality. You go up and around your enemies. Okay, so then Ninja Gaiden answers this with blocking and countering, which makes a lot of sense because Ninja Gaiden is obviously influenced by Dead or Alive, Team Ninja's other game. And so the real balancing act with these types of mechanics is having something that can help players adapt to the complexities of 3D space without completely negating its strengths. And the trend that we've really seen in the past few years is developers are sick of dealing with all of this because it's hard for them, it's hard for the player, it's just hard for everyone. So why don't we just eliminate this problem as much as possible? And that has kind of become the answer, and what we're seeing time and time again with things like suck to target, centralized parries, teleporting, ultra homing attacks. Developers more and more just want to remove the 3D question.
Having gameplay that was on your side meant that regardless of how you played, we knew it felt terrible to attack and miss an enemy who looked like it was right in front of you, even if it really was a good distance away.
But there is an alternative, and that alternative comes from today's game, Spikeout, with its shift mechanic. Spikeout's shift is probably one of my favorite mechanics of all time. Let me explain to you what shift in Spikeout is, because when you first play the game and you look at the controls and stuff, and you see that your character locks their face in a specific direction, it seems like at first this is just some mechanic to deal with the fact that Spikeout doesn't have two analog sticks, and it's a way to deal with turning. And there is an element to that. Yes, you use it to turn and stuff, but that's not the primary effect. The primary effect is that you become more evasive with tighter turning and faster movement speed. Yes, their attacks still exist in physical space, and so if you're surrounded by dudes and they're swinging, turning shift, it doesn't create invulnerability, but what it does is it allows you to maneuver through real 3D space around the attacks, and the trade-off is when you're in shift, you can't grab. Where does this idea come from? It comes from Virtua Fighter, because Sega created Spikeout, Sega created Virtua Fighter 3. Virtua Fighter 3 has a sidestep system. This is sidestep realized in a 3D action game, and it is amazing. And it keeps the fundamentals of the combat constantly at play. And what this allows you to do as a player is to stay really close and precise in your spacing, and it creates a ton of granularity. Standing just out of reach of an attack is now not only feasible, but expected. And that is what makes the magic of Spikeout happen. It's not a static state of did you shift, it's how much did you shift and where. It's a subtle mechanic, but extremely powerful. And like many other subtle but extremely powerful mechanics, it was completely misunderstood during its time. Very much like another game that was clearly very inspired by Spikeout. These days, IGN's unfair treatment of Godhand has passed into internet legend, to the point where IGN had to go back and sort of make an apology type of review for Godhand. But what isn't widely discussed is that before Godhand, there was Spikeout, and I consider the two sibling games. Spikeout is the older brother to Godhand, and I think it's very obvious how much Mikami was inspired by Spikeout directly. You can see that with the charging mechanic. You can see that with the general camera system, even with the little UI HUD and everything. You can see that with the enemy design, and even with the sidestepping dodge system of Godhand. You can see that being a response to shifting. It's just taking a more locked in style, but you can definitely see a crazy amount of overlap between them. And Spikeout was immensely popular in Japan in the arcade. That is the big difference here, is that Godhand was made for a Western audience that rejected it. Spikeout was made for a Japanese arcade audience that love it. It is cult legendary status in Japan. And in fact, all of the videos pretty much you see of amazing Spikeout players, they're all Japanese players because they come from Virtua Fighter, and Virtua Fighter in Japan has this massive presence. And so that all being said, when Battle Street was released on the Xbox in 2004, it was eviscerated. And I was a little bit curious as to what the rejection of it would be, because Battle Street isn't the most perfectly presented port. I think it's pretty solid, and we'll get into that later on. But it could have been criticized on the basis of not being that great of a port or anything, and them being like, no, Spikeout is the true version. We need more arcade accuracy. But that is not at all what they are complaining about. If you go and read the reviews, they are outright disgusted by arcade design. We talk about bias in game critique, but no one remembers just how visceral and insane the anti-arcade bias in game critique during this era was. You don't have to read between the lines here. I'll give you a sample of quotes. This is from IGN's review of Battle Street.
There is nothing quite like the simple button-mashing arcade game. It takes your mind off problems. You rely strictly on impulse and hand-eye coordination, and for a short period of time, you're free to beat up thugs on the street. The gratuitous feeling of pure button mashing is a relief, but the thrill doesn't last long, and the game is anything but deep.
And now compare these quotes to the very same quotes leveled at Godhand.
And now we're presented with Godhand, the studio's latest release and also its oddest so far, largely mimicking the brawlers from the old days of gaming in a kooky 3D world. Much of the control and gameplay mechanics are so old school, it hurts. It's an extremely tedious brawler, where you'll generally mash a button or two until an enemy is dead. The bottom line is that Godhand quickly becomes a boring, annoying, and frustrating game.
And you will see this era did not respect arcade design at all. And it's not that they didn't understand it, it's that they didn't want to understand it. It isn't like a misguided attempt to try to see what's going on with these games. They just outright reject what this game is doing as a premise. And so one thing that I find very interesting, and it's a common thread, is this idea that Spikeout is shallow, that arcade beat-em-up design is shallow, that it's button mashing, quarter munching, arcade garbage.
You're such a jerk, Junior. The best beat-em-ups have depth and technique beneath the seemingly simple exterior.
Spikeout lacks any depth whatsoever.
There's a jump button and a strong attack that can be charged for 3 different levels of attack effects.
It's 4, actually.
And that's it.
No fooling?
No fooling.
Apparently, we're cool.
Totally. If by cool, you mean a 1 out of 5.
If you want to hear my full thoughts on depth in game design, check out The Deepest Games Are Dumb. But I would hope it's pretty obvious that judging the merits of a game's combat system off of the number of moves is a really shallow form of analysis. And to address the criticism of Spikeout's
kindergarten level design,
IGN is presumably saying this because it's direct and dense, which I would argue is a real strength of the game's level design. Especially in Spikeout, the levels are nicely constrained, and the environment itself really plays into the combat system with walls, with little passages, with room to move around, especially like I said, because your spacing is manual. If you have a bunch of enemies around you in a tight enclosed space, they can choke you out and you can't really get around them. And then conversely, if you line enemies up in an enclosed space and you start using level 4 kicks, now you are using the choke point against the enemies. And you can see Spikeout really playing with these dynamics. Like, for example, in the mall stage, there's this part where you fight the enemies on a carousel and the ground is actually moving as you're fighting. There's also conveyor belts. So yeah, these are the elements of level design, in my opinion, much more so than tossing in Baby's first platforming section or something. And so why were critics so negatively disposed to 3D beat-em-ups like Godhand and Spikeout? It's because they did not understand them on a fundamental level, and you can tell because of this accusation of button mashing. There is no combat system out there that is less based on button mashing than Spikeout. Spikeout consistently punishes button mashing more than any other action game I can think of. That's why I love it so much. And so if Spikeout is not based on button mashing, what is it based on? What is the underlying philosophy of its combat design? Well, if you look at its influences, obviously Virtua Fighter, the answer is simple: Nitaku. So Nitaku is the organizing principle of 3 key components of combat: strikes, grabs, and blocks, or invulnerability in Spikeout's case.
Nitaku, which translates from Japanese as two choice, is the concept of forcing your opponent into situations where they feel like they're forced to guess, while you have the privilege of being the only person aware of what's going to happen next. Nitaku vastly reduces the number of possible outcomes to 2, because the majority of those options at a certain frame advantage will all have the same outcome.
And yes, at higher levels, mix-ups ensue because the strike is expected, but this is how you set that baseline offensive frame advantage. You begin with the strike, the elbow, and then if they block it, or in the case of Spikeout, they're invulnerable or you missed, you back off because you're at frame disadvantage. Always remember, in Virtua Fighter and in Spikeout, you need to be constantly aware of frame advantage, frame disadvantage. And so what do you do if you're at frame disadvantage? You can either sidestep, shift out of the way. That's very reliable. That's kind of the go-to answer. Or if there's time pressure, you can abare. Abare means attack again anyway, and just hope that you beat out their attack. And I do love the way Spikeout allows for abare, but then also beats the hell out of you for trying to do it too much. The boss design is especially built around this dynamic, like explicitly. So if you're wondering how to deal with the bosses and why sometimes your strings are connecting with the bosses and other times the bosses do just a fully invulnerable attack, that's because the game insists on frame advantage. So if you're attacking from disadvantage, you're taking your life into your own hands. It's sometimes necessary because of the timer, which I love. I think that really adds to the depth of the game. But anyway, if you really screw yourself over and put yourself in a massively disadvantaged position, then desperation attack might be the only option left to you. But always use that as a last resort because it's a very valuable resource. And we'll talk about that more later. And so that is what happens in the first sequence of Nitaku if your strike fails. Either you missed or they were invulnerable. So in the second sequence, your strike connects and you are now at frame advantage. But remember, Spikeout has multiple opponents. Going back to what I was talking about before, how does the game account for multiple opponents? This is how. Because even if your attack connects to the guy in front of you, and that opens you up to now do the string into a combo, well, his friend standing next to him is not going to allow you to do that. The enemy design is programmed to attack you when it specifically knows that you're committed to a string on another opponent. And so if you hit the guy and there's no backup, then it's fiesta time. You got the counter hit. Outcome 1, you convert the string into a juggle combo. This is especially good if you're near a wall and you can continue the combo even up against the wall. So that's 1. Number 2, you can convert the string into a quick knockdown. That's especially good if his friends are getting close. Number 3, you can convert the string into a grab. Or number 4, you can go into a special stun state using C3. And this can set up for all kinds of fun little tactics and strategies, including recomboing them again. And then number 5, Godhand fans will appreciate this, you can set them up into a launching projectile, where basically at the end of the combo you hit them with C4, the biggest charge attack, and it launches their body as a projectile. And this is actually something you use quite often, especially later on, for crowd control. So yes, every time you hit an opponent and you convert it into a string, that string can take so many different shapes and forms, and there's so much flexibility and rhythm to putting in the charge attacks with the strings. I'll talk about that more in the how to play section, but it's a beautiful system and obviously does not get nearly the credit that it deserves.
Better run home to mama now.
Which brings us to the final outcome of Nitaku, where you do your strike, and because of the context of the situation with surrounding enemies, or you're fighting a particular boss that shuts down strings, now it's time to go for the grab. If you are a fan of 2D beat-em-ups like Final Fight and Streets of Rage, which I am obviously, Spikeout is the 3D grab system for you. And that's because the grab system of the game, yes, you use it to do damage and punishment, especially on the bosses, but in multiple opponent situations, which is the majority of the game, you use the throws for safety and crowd control. I say safety because you get iframes when you're throwing and when you're pummeling. So you have the direction-based throw. This is the bread and butter. This is throwing the opponent into a group of opponents to knock them down. And so the other option is to go for a back throw, Resident Evil 4 suplex style. And you can get a back throw either by grabbing them from the back, or if you grab them from the side or from the front, if you press the charge button, you will move into the back throw position. This moving to back throw position, though, is vulnerable. So if you're in the middle of a crowd, it's kind of dangerous to go for this, but it's still very good. And then on top of that, you set up for the air throw, which is basically the most powerful throw in the game, besides the special throw, but that requires a resource. And there are certain big fat enemies that you can't throw, which is a great bit of enemy design, but you can still air throw them. So keep that in mind when you accidentally grab a big guy. And then there's side throws, which you can't get in a 2D beat 'em up, right? This is 3D exclusive, baby. The strength of the side throw is that it's just naturally good to grab opponents by the side, right? Because they are more vulnerable on their sides than they are at their front. And so side throw is like this cool intermediary throw between a back and a front throw. And the way I think about side throws is they are the emergency throw. When you're surrounded by a bunch of guys and you need iframes real fast and real reliably, the side throw is right there for you. And then of course we've got to talk about the special throw, which is the other half of the desperation attack resource. And I think it's really cool how this game has one central resource that can either be spent towards a defensive option, the desperation attack, or you can spend the resource on an offensive option, the special throw, which does a lot of damage. And you can set it up in situations, especially if you get enemies at the walls, where you're spinning and you're not only damaging the boss or whatever opponent you're grabbing, you're also doing a ton of splash damage and like juggle damage to everything. I think it's a fantastic system that lends to the routing of the game a lot, and special throw makes it happen. So what's interesting is that Spikeout does not have a player progression system. But what it does have is an enemy progression system, where as you advance through the game, it is the enemies that help you uncover your moveset and help you understand how to use all of the tools. Because if you don't use all of your weaponry available to you, you'll just get destroyed. The game specifically crafts enemies to test your skill set, and it's truly adversarial in the way it shuts down rote strategy. For example, early on in the game, the enemies are extremely passive and permissive, and they will allow you to just mash your beat string over and over again, like we see in the reviewer footage. But as the game progresses, the enemy types start to escalate where they will start to counter jab you. So button mashing will only get you so far in the game. Now you're going to have to uncover and start using more of your moveset. So you may decide, you know what, I'm just going to rely on raw grabs a lot. I did this early on where I started just running up and raw grabbing enemies. But what ends up happening when you get into grab range, they'll punch you in the face. So, okay, what am I supposed to do here? And so then you start baiting out punches and then start going for like side grabs and stuff like that. And you're like, yes. And then you think, well, I'll just be patient and wait for them to whiff their entire string. So if it takes 3 swings for them to get to their whiff animation, I'll just stand and wait for those 3 swings. But then you look up at the top of the screen and that timer's ticking down. You're like, oh crap, I need to get more aggressive here. And especially as you get into later on in the game, there are enemy types who will just stand there and wait like a shark. They're just circling you. And what they're doing is they're just waiting for you to do some sort of committed attack. They are like Justin Wong or something. They're just standing back, running out the timer on you. You like, you son of a... And so what's awesome is that the game is always playing against some sort of overwhelming play style. So if you're just Mr. Rushdown and aggressive, you're going to have enemies doing jumping knees, interrupting things. You're going to have enemies with invulnerability. So you can't just constantly rush everyone down. But then on the other side, if you're like, no, I'm going to be patient as a monk and just one by one bait out openings, well, that timer is ticking down, and then there's plenty of enemies who know that the timer is ticking down, and they're perfectly fine to watch you slowly die in front of them.
Hurry up.
So what ends up happening is that the play style the game ultimately encourages is versatility, is knowing specific situational awareness, just like Virtua Fighter. You can't just play lame, and you can't just play aggressive. You have to adapt to what the enemy is adapting to, and so you have this amazing dynamic where the enemy's adapting to you, and then you're counter-adapting to the enemy, and then the enemy through the types are counter-adapting later on to other strategies. One of the funniest ones is that there's enemies that just beg to be hit with raw C4s, and you go to launch the C4 and the enemy just stops right out of range, just stands right at the range of your C4, and then you're like, okay. Another funny one is if you grab an enemy and you jump in the air to do an air throw, the enemies look up at you and then they just start backing away so you can't hit them with the air throw. These types of subtle maneuvers from the enemies go a long way of giving the game its depth and its dynamic feel, because nothing ever feels static. Whenever you come into the enemy encounters, the enemies do have proclivities that you want to exploit, but it's all very fuzzy and soft. And so when you come into an encounter, you have this macro plan, but then as situations unfold, maybe you're gonna have to adjust on the fly. And what's really cool about getting good in Spikeout is that it's not this sudden leap forward that you're like, oh my God, now I just totally mastered the game because I know the level layouts and everything like that. It's much more holistic and gradual, where run to run, situation by situation, you just slowly improve. And a lot of that comes down to how dynamic and adaptable the enemy design is. I think Spikeout, along with Ninja Gaiden, is the gold standard for enemy AI. The boss fights in Spikeout are really interesting because they're essentially elite enemies with special properties. And when I say it like that, it almost sounds like an insult, but it is far from it. Because the beauty about having elite-style enemy bosses is that they are still interacting in the core combat system. So often what we find with a lot of modern game boss fights is that you have the game's combat system, and then you have some little side game that is the boss fight that relies entirely on novelty rather than doubling down on the core combat system. Think of your favorite boss fights in a lot of action games. They're the bosses that are essentially elite enemies. This is something that Souls does really well, and why Souls boss fights are so beloved is because Souls uses the core combat system for the boss fights. Very similar here in Spikeout, where Spikeout, the bosses do play by the rules of the enemies. They just require more versatility. They just are pushing the limits of the core combat system in specific ways, where they want really tight punishes or they want specific grab setups, or they're going to shut down certain things. And you have a ton of different variations of boss styles that you need to get familiar with, but they're all testing the elements of the core combat in a specific way. And so that is what I like to see. I like to see in action games boss versatility, not boss novelty. Even the end of Ninja Gaiden 2, I consider the final bosses to be more Elizabeth and Fiend Genshin than that giant creature that you shoot with a bow. That just feels like too much of a little mini game, whereas the final boss of Spikeout is a mission statement of the game's overall design.
Here comes the boss.
First off, you have to fight the boss on this tiny floating platform. So no running around. You've got to be up close and personal with him. And then on top of that, as you've been doing a bunch of crowd control and grabbing enemies throughout the game, turns out the final boss, he can do the same thing. And so he's summoning this army of minions to help him, but he also has no problem using them as resources against you, just like you have been doing against the other bosses. I think that's super cool. I don't know if I've seen that in other games, maybe, but I think that's really awesome. And then you have the whole time pressure situation also happening, because if you get knocked off the platform, it doesn't do that much damage or anything, but then you're sent down to this bottom floor and you have to run back up the stairs. Things are tense now because you're running low on time, and you can gain time by fighting his minions. But while you're fighting his minions, you also have to deal with his aggression. And so it's a perfect encapsulation of all of the skills that you've built up for in Spikeout now being tested all at once together. So yeah, I love the final boss of the game and the final stage overall. Just a perfect climax. When you beat him, you're like, that is Spikeout. Which brings us to how to play Spikeout. Now, this is not going to be a comprehensive tutorial on how to play the game. Testament has a really good guide on how to get started if you want to check that out. Shoutouts to that guide. But I think it's important, at least in this review, to give you a baseline understanding of what to do. And then from there, you can develop your own strategies and find your own routes and everything.
Cool.
The first thing that you want to do, like I said in the intro, is understand shifting. Shifting is the baseline template of everything that you're doing. So basically, the rule of thumb is that if you're not attacking, you should be shifting. So if you're moving around with enemies around you, unless you're running towards them or something, shift and move. And when you're coming out of combos, when you're coming out of knockdowns, buffer that shift. And then step 2, strike grabs, my friends. Because 1, you get the hit stun advantage, and 2, it turns you into the direction of the grab, which is insanely useful and reliable. So if you want to play the game properly, you need to learn how to strike grab, and it's not that hard. And then, of course, we have the charge system. Charging in Spikeout rules. I love it. It complements the game's shifting dynamic super well, the throw game super well, the wake up game super well. This is, again, one of those genre-defining mechanics that was in Godhand, and you look around, you're like, damn, why don't more action games use charge mechanics like this? So the way charging works, this is very important, is charging is not a resource. It's not Devil Trigger. It's 4 unique attacks united elegantly on a single button. The longer you hold it, the heavier the attack becomes. But it's not the case that, oh, you want level 4s all the time because level 4s is the biggest move, so just constantly go for level 4s. No, they have context, they have utility, and yes, you are going to use all of the charge attacks, charge 1, charge 2, charge 3, and charge 4 situationally, and the more that you master when and where to use the attacks, the deeper you get into the game's combat system. And with that being said, rule number 1 with the charge mechanic, please, I beg you,
Buffer the charge.
If you are not buffering charge, you are not playing Spikeout correctly. It is very tempting, I do it all the time in the footage, to wander around and just charge a level 4C and then try to fire off a level 4C, but don't be doing that. What you want to do is you want to mix in the charge with throws, with jab strings, and it will just elegantly integrate into your moveset.
Bingo.
Alrighty, we've talked about how to play Spikeout in a gameplay sense, but how the hell do you play Spikeout in a platform sense? Unfortunately, we don't have like a really robust M2 style port. I would love that. Honestly, Sega, what are you doing? That being said, the first and obviously the best way to play Spikeout is in the Model 3 emulator. And also the thing about this emulator that's really awesome is this widescreen hack. So you'll notice a lot of the footage is in genuine widescreen. That's only possible on this emulator from what I understand. Yakuza doesn't have it, Battle Street doesn't have it, and it's really cool. And I think it complements the camera system really well. So yes, clearly the best possible way to play the game. And then after that, we've got the Yakuza ports. So there are 2 Yakuza games with Spikeout in them. There's Infinite and there's Like a Pirate. So Infinite is the first to come out, and in terms of features, it basically has nothing. I do think the built-in scanlines look pretty good, and you can map your controls, but they didn't allow you to be able to map sweep as a button, which is kind of important that they overlook that. Also, you'll notice like you have this border.
You have to have this border.
There's no video options. There's nothing.
Failure.
On paper, it sounds like the next version of Yakuza Pirates. That one is the better one to get because it also has Spikeout and it has more features. So it has the hard version available. It has a stage select. The thing about it, it is to get to because in Infinite Wealth, to get to the arcade is literally like 5 minutes. In Pirates, I don't actually know how long it takes to get to Spikeouts because I had to wander around for hours and I was trying to look up like guides. Is there like a shortcut to get to this? Is there some way to get to it faster? And I couldn't find any resources because no one gives a shit. And so technically the Pirates version has the stage select and it has more options, but be prepared. You're going to have to deal with a bunch of bullshit. And I have to point out what a sloppy mess this version of Yakuza combat is. Now, I do not think Yakuza has ever lived up to the depth and strength of Spikeout's combat, but if you look at the earlier Yakuza games, you can see some sort of DNA link between Spikeout and Yakuza. But holy crap, this Pirates combat is like all of the bad modern action game trends mixed together all at once. What is happening, Yakuza? Whoever did this combat design better not be in the room while they're working on Virtua Fighter 6. That's all I've got to say. But in terms of features and actually treating the game like a legit game, the Yakuza versions just do not do it justice. Though they are the only like way to buy the game if you want to buy it. Which brings us to the first console release,
Spikeout Battle Street.
Yes, Battle Street. I feel like I could do an entire video on this remake port master. The developer that made Battle Street is Dimps. They did Dragon Ball Z Budokai, which I kind of have a soft spot for. And the idea of Battle Street, I think, is really clear, which is if you look at Dead or Alive 2 Ultimate on the Xbox, that is what Battle Street wants to be. Clearly, Ultimate is awesome, by the way. It's these amazing Xbox-looking graphics, and it's still very faithful and true to the arcade game, and it was beloved, and everyone was high-fiving. And so I could see Dimps looking at Spikeout, and they're like, oh, we could do that too. And they did put a lot of sincere effort into this. I have to say, it has like multiplayer. You can't use that anymore. And it is true to the core combat of the game. They didn't add any second analog stick nonsense or mess around with the mechanics or anything. But that being said, it isn't like fully accurate either. Like some of the collision feels a little generous compared to Spikeout, and the enemy design, it's still active, but it feels a little bit more relaxed. It's like a bit more chill, relaxed version of Spikeout. It is the console version of the game. Though I do really appreciate that for the story mode, they actually require you to beat the story mode sections on 1 life, which can be pretty damn challenging, I have to say. And the way they broke up the structure, I think, for story mode is actually pretty cool, which is in arcade mode, there is the branching paths. And so what they did is they just took pieces of the paths and made them into little self-contained chapters, and then they removed the time limit. But then they do have the arcade mode in there with the timers, and then they have a bunch of extra characters included. And a lot of the new characters are OP as hell, but they're also like
really fun.
So overall, is Battle Street a great example of Spikeout at its best? No, it won't measure up to the arcade version at all, but it is like a fun extra. It has the heart in the right place, let me say that. Like, the execution isn't fully there. It's a little off in many ways, but it is trying to be faithful to the game in the way that it can be. And I really appreciate it. I think it's really cool. I feel like if they managed to do a little bit of a better job on the graphical quality, Battle Street would now be looked back on as a real hidden gem, because the gameplay is there. But the problem is that the environmental design is a little Tony Hawk's Underground, as in like create your own skate park Tony Hawk's Underground. And some of the later sections, like the mall and stuff, look okay, but you have to get all the way down there. And you could tell what essentially happened is they did a pretty good job with the character designs, but I think they kind of ran out of time on the environments because they feel very underdeveloped in terms of their visual texture and quality, which is a shame. But yeah, graphical blandness aside, a surprising amount of effort went into this bad boy. And so, final thoughts. Yeah, Spikeout is an all-time masterpiece, and I don't use that term lightly. I do consider it the best 3D beat-em-up and probably one of the best 3D action games of all time. And I say that with a bit of a bittersweet feeling, because as much as I feel that and can justify it with analysis and gameplay and experience and connecting with a cult audience, it does make me a little bit sad that I think it will ultimately always be overlooked. And so I'm definitely going to be continuing to play it. And I want to thank the Patreons for selecting it for a review, because it's been an awesome week playing it and reviewing it. I found a new all-time favorite for sure. And speaking of the patrons, if you enjoyed this review, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends, and support me on Patreon, because you're not going to be able to have Spikeout reviews and like really in-depth arcade stuff without the support of the patrons, and they are what makes it happen, and I really appreciate it a lot. And the Patreon has a lot of cool content. I think there's going to be a video coming up pretty soon for the Patreon that will tie into great arcade design, so if you're interested in that, check that out. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons from 100, Aptonitis, Adam Kesey, Eternal Solitude, Anhold, AJA, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alberto Starna, Aldrin, Alex Kors, Alexander Pfeiffer, AMH, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Orlandio, A Royal Guard, Arg, Arrow Viper, Ash FL, AU Li, Autonamed, Axel Rate, Band Over Chewy, Baron Metzgerstein, Battle Mode, Basil Medazzle, Bella Tor Poeta, Ben Foster, Benjamin Shabalski, Vito Dames, BK, Blader, Boghog, Borgie22, Boston Crab, Bradley Straight, Brindle Swiftfoam, Robot, Rotoquin the Lonely Poet, Bruh, Bruno DeMatos, Buford, Bunny Clyde, Wham, Captain Rhodes, Captain Shrimp, Caramel Tortoise, Catfight Studio, Chop, Jack Goulding, Shamor Day Colette, Jado Maltese, Jay Flip, Kristen SoCal, Krista Lee, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Zipolino, Clairvoyant Bongwater, Claire Cliff, Climby Coyote, CMD, Coast, Concealed Blaze, Concreted, Cooksan 666, Cooks and Soup, Corio, Corn Hoglin, Cozy, Crew Expendable, CZR, Des Audio, DRK, Damian Thorne, Dan Matai, Danji, Danny Maku, Darren Griffin, David Andrus, David Crespo, Dididum, Dave Derator, Damian Smirnov, Dayram, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Diodamke, DJ420 Praise It, Don Pedro, Double Vision, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Drayton Brenton, Duality, Duckies, Easter Egg, Eduardo Aquinta, Edvard Walgren, Elvin Senesev, Elias Alonso, Ellis DeFische, Empty Disco, Eric Scribner, Eric Houdini, Esteban Lazama, Evan Serafet, Ewil, Explosive General Games, Fabio Picci, Falcus, Finette Mathai, Firez, Five Side, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Freckle Lord, Gabriel Foreigner, Game Soup, Game Boy Guru, Gabe Chase, Galehoff, Gettershine, Ghost Boy, GPM, Hawk, Hamadawama, Heart, HDZ7274, Hero Death, Thomas Hardhat, Unhearthy, HUD, Humongous, HW Folder, Infinite Forest, Arandms, JDabs, Jack Walsh, Jacob Foley, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, James M, Jason, Jay McCarthy, JC Dendon, J67, JLab, JCC, Jeremy Kellner, Jezza SDG, Jang, Jing Hans, Jin, JMD, Joey Jojo Joestar, JOH, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, Jorge Figueroa, Josaka, Josh Mayer, Josie, JT, Julian Elwood, Jurgen, K, K2, Kane Evans, Casper K, K02, Ken1082, Kevin Den, Christian Lopez, Kill All Music, King Joker, Contain, Praise the Boys, Kumoma, Kai Arts, Kyrol, Leonard McCoy, Loberta, Lobos, Luna Lilich, Maz, Macabre Monster, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Maplewood, Marco Singer, Mario Simic, Markman, Marshmallow, Mason Polar, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Matau Patau, Maz, Mekaroka, Minong, Meister, Mens Rea, Metal Slime Drummer, Michael Del Polito, Michael Faircloth, Michael McCord, Michael Smith, Mig ZDM, Mike Mel, Milk Lipton, Milo Shimel, Jamel, Mimi573, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitwid, M. Kusanagi, Morog, Monroe, Munsta Zero, Musashi, Michigan, Naps91, Nathan Grimm, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Pero, Neon Dagger Games, Neon Ninja, Nervous J, Neuroshima, Nicholas Reichman, Nikki Negative, Nicole, Niflheim, Neo04, Oatware, Vocal Googles, Oleg Tolmasev, Panzer Dragoon should have been arcade, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Parole, Peace, Pedro Isiles, Philip Plus, Pizza Belly, Platinum Mad, PLP, Pocho, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Psychovania, Punch MSX, Queen Charlene, Quinn Long Jaeger, R2 Sinus, Raccoons, Raphael Trujillo, Randoom, Raul VP, Rapido, RC, Real Skeen, Renthalt's Time, Repo Man, Retrojet, Retroman, Retro Schmupper, Richter, Riff Mason, Robert Chang, Roop Olander, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Rulo, Running a Coup, Salmon Connections, Sanivo, Sarn, Scanline City, Sen Pie Please, Serial XP Greg, Shader Bunny, Jazzy, Jitsu Supreme, Jinjutsu 1600, Shiny, Shmup Junkie, Shmup Run, True, Simon Pollen, Simply Chrono, Sirapong, Skater to Employ, Social Kid, Spagward, Spiders SGG, Spongy, Spooky Tanaku, Steady AI, Step Level, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Synth Milk, Temsarian, Taze Ryu, Ted Ray 77, The Dirty Screech, The Cacao, The N1, Gil Bensta, Tom McCarthy, Tim French, Team Money, Tofu Man, Tom Faze, Travis Arbon, Tricky P, Tristan, Tsugumo, Turam, 2IU, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Typeware, Unchristian, Eurokeeper, Ursua, Ushimushi, Val, Vandal, Velenix, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Vincetti Brits, Vizard 16, Vlad STG, Wappy Legs, What is this? William Miller, William Wallace, Yakiback, Yaz, YB8, Your Nerdy Joe, Eastbird, Zachary Patton, Zach, Zenryoku, Zingus.